Hey, should a seller ever let a buyer move in their home before closing? I had a seller one time that had a property under contract, and the buyer and the seller just happened to know each other. And the buyer reached out to the seller, unbeknownst to me, and asked the seller, can I move into the house early? My lease is expiring on my rental property and I have nowhere to go. Well, the seller, trying to be a nice guy, agreed to let him move in, and well, that's when the issues started. First, the seller still had a few things in the house and they had to scramble around and get those out, while the buyer was pressuring him to move faster and go faster because of the buyer's situation. The buyer then moved into the house, and lo and behold, when you know it, the buyer started finding little knick-knacky, tiddly-winksy type stuff that they wanted the seller to come back in and fix after we'd already gotten through that whole process, a lot of cosmetic stuff. And then, lo and behold, the loan wasn't approved, and we couldn't get it to the closing table, and that was just horrible, because then all of a sudden what happens in South Carolina, a Tenant-Landlord Act comes into play. So now it's not a purchase situation, it's a rental situation, and that tenant has certain rights. So then the seller had to go through the full-blown eviction process to get that buyer out of the home. And of course, what? There's a little damage to the property when it happens. So needless to say, they're not friends anymore, but all of that boils down to, is it smart for a seller to let a buyer move into the house prior to closing? So let's unpack a seller allowing a buyer to move into a property prior to closing. First thing I want you to think about is the Landlord-Tenant Act. A tenant has certain rights when they move into a piece of property, and you have to go through a full-blown eviction process to get them to get out of the property if something were to happen, if you allowed that buyer to move into your property prior to closing and the deal doesn't close. Loan issues. What if issues with an appraisal come up? Issues with the buyer's qualification come up? At the best, then, it's going to extend that period of time that the buyer is in the property prior to closing. At worst, what might happen? The deal might not close. And if the deal doesn't close, that puts you squarely in the marks of the Landlord-Tenant Act, and you would have to go through that eviction process. Then you have to consider the condition of the home. Condition of the home when the buyer moves in. Has that been acceptable? Is anything going to come up after they move in and started living there for a little while? And then even more importantly, what if the deal doesn't close and the buyer has to move out? You have to evict that buyer. What are they going to do to the property when they're moving out? Or what did they do to it while they were living there for 30, 45, 60 days that you may not have wanted done to the property? All of that to say that there's a ton of stress on both sides of the equation if a seller lets the buyer move into a property prior to closing.